The shuttle's descent felt like being swallowed. Julian Cross pressed his forehead against the viewport, watching the Valkyrie homeworld rise to meet him like a jewel someone had cracked open and filled with light. Cities sprawled across the continents below in patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometry that seemed to shift when he tried to focus, as if the streets themselves were breathing. First time seeing a Class 7 civilization up close, Ambassador. The pilot's voice crackled through his headset, amused. First time being called Ambassador, actually, Julian admitted. 3 weeks ago, I was processing trade permits for asteroid mining operations. Now, I'm humanity's best hope for not getting laughed out of the galaxy. The pilot snorted. Well, don't touch anything important. Julian would remember that advice later and wish he'd asked for specifics. The palace materialized through the cloud layer like a fever dream, rendered in crystal and bioluminescence. It wasn't built so much as grown, vast organic towers spiraling upward in defiance of physics, connected by bridges that seemed to exist in more dimensions than Julian's brain wanted to acknowledge. The whole structure pulsed with light that moved beneath its surface like blood through veins, colors shifting through spectrums his eyes couldn't quite name. His briefing materials had called it the heart of the Valkyrie Empire. Looking at it now, Julian thought it resembled more of a brain, ancient, alien, and absolutely judging him. The shuttle settled onto a landing platform that rippled under its weight, the surface adjusting its molecular density to cradle the vessel. Julian's stomach lurched. He'd been in space for 3 months getting here, had survived the crushing boredom of light-speed travel and the recycled air that tasted like regret, and now his body was rebelling against gravity that felt almost but not quite like Earth's. "Try not to throw up on their shoes," he muttered to himself, grabbing his diplomatic case. "That's probably in the handbook under don't." The airlock hissed open, and Julian stepped into air that tasted like ozone and something sweet he couldn't identify. A welcoming committee waited, arranged in a semicircle that was definitely meant to be intimidating. Valkyrie soldiers in armor that seemed to be part uniform and part living organism, their long pointed ears swept back in what his cultural briefings suggested was formal neutrality. Between them stood administrators in robes that changed color when they moved, patterns swirling across the fabric like oil on water. And in the center, the queen. Sarethva stood a head taller than her attendants, draped in something that looked like woven starlight. Her face could have been human, pale skin, sharp cheekbones, eyes that tilted slightly upward at the corners, except for those ears, rising from her silver hair in elegant points that marked her as utterly other. Those eyes fixed on Julian with the weight of something that had watched civilizations rise and fall, and he felt suddenly, acutely aware that he was 28 years old and completely unqualified for this moment. Ambassador Cross. Her voice carried harmonics that his translator struggled with, rendering them as a slight echo. "Welcome to the heart. We trust your journey was tolerable." Julian bowed, trying to remember the exact angle that conveyed respect without submission. 45 degrees, or was it 30? He split the difference and hoped alien mathematics worked in his favor. "Your Majesty, the honor is entirely humanity's. Thank you for receiving us." The formal words felt like marbles in his mouth. "The journey was long, but the destination makes it worthwhile. Your palace is," he gestured vaguely at the impossible architecture surrounding them. "Well, it's certainly something, in a good way. A very good, impressive, please don't conquer Earth kind of way." One of the administrators made a sound like wind through hollow tubes. The soldiers' ears twitched. Julian couldn't tell if they were amused or appalled, and his briefing materials had been frustratingly vague on Valkyrie emotional expressions. But Sarethva's lips curved just slightly. "Your candor is refreshing. Most diplomats who arrive here speak in circles until we grow dizzy watching them. I'd love to take credit for a strategy, but honestly I'm just bad at formal speeches," Julian said, then immediately wondered if honesty was actually the best policy here. My superiors chose me because I was available, which should tell you something about humanity's diplomatic depth chart. It tells us you are uncertain of your worth. Sarathva turned, her robes creating afterimages in the air. Come, we will show you the palace, and you will tell us why we should bind our people to yours in alliance. No pressure then, Julian thought, following her into the depths of the heart. The corridors defied every architectural principle Julian knew. Walls curved in directions that shouldn't exist, their surfaces rippling with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to track his movement. The floor beneath his feet felt almost soft, like walking on dense foam but left no footprints. Gravity shifted subtly as they walked, sometimes pulling him forward, sometimes pressing down harder, as if the palace itself was testing his balance. The heart is alive in a sense, Sarathva explained, noticing his discomfort. It responds to intention, to purpose. It has grown with my people for 10,000 of your years. That's older than human writing, Julian said, craning his neck to watch ceiling panels that opened and closed like breathing gills. We're still figuring out how to keep our buildings standing for a century without maintenance. Yes, we have observed your structures, charmingly temporary. Julian couldn't tell if she was insulting him or not. He decided to take it as not. They entered a vast hall where the walls had been replaced entirely by something like glass, except it showed views of space that couldn't possibly be visible from this angle. Nebulas swirling in real-time, distant galaxies rotating slowly. The Hall of Ancestors, Sarathva called it. Crystalline pillars rose from the floor like frozen trees, each one containing swirls of light that moved with apparent intelligence. Genetic memories, the queen said, running her fingers along one pillar. Every ruler of the Velkhari, their experiences encoded and preserved. I can access the thoughts of my predecessors, know what they knew, feel what they felt. Julian stared at the pillars, trying to imagine carrying thousands of years of memories. That sounds incredibly useful and also completely overwhelming. You understand quickly. Sarathva looked at him with something that might have been approval. Most species envy our continuity, few grasp its burden. Well, humans forget what they had for breakfast, so we're coming at it from the opposite problem. Julian stepped closer to one of the pillars, watching light coil inside it like trapped lightning. Although I once knew a guy who claimed he could remember every meal he'd ever eaten, we called him Dave the Database. Nobody invited him to dinner parties. That sound again from the attendants, that hollow wind noise. Sarathva's expression remained controlled, but Julian caught the faintest brightening in her eyes. You make jokes when nervous, she observed. I make jokes when breathing, Julian admitted. It's either that or scream, and screaming seemed diplomatically questionable. They continued through chambers that showcased Velkhari history. Wars fought against species Julian had never heard of, technological breakthroughs that made human science look like children playing with blocks, art that existed in 4 dimensions, and gave him a headache to perceive. Sarathva narrated with the practiced ease of someone who had given this tour countless times, but Julian noticed she watched him more than the exhibits, as if his reactions were more interesting than the wonders she was displaying. Your people are young, she said as they walked. Barely 3 centuries since you left your birth world. Why should the Velkhari tie ourselves to such newcomers? Julian had prepared an answer for this. A careful speech about human potential and adaptability, and all the other buzzwords his superiors had drilled into him. But standing in this palace of living memory, surrounded by proof of millennia of achievements, the prepared words felt hollow. Honestly, I don't have a great answer, he said instead. We're young and we're clumsy and we barely understand the galaxy we've stumbled into. But we're trying, and maybe that counts for something. We know we need help, need guidance, and we're willing to admit it. That's got to be worth something in galactic politics. Sarathva stopped walking. She turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. 3,000 years ago, I met an ambassador from the Kresh Collective. Do you know what he told me? Julian shook his head. He told me his people were destined to rule the galaxy. That alliance with the Velkari was a gift we should be grateful to receive. His civilization collapsed into civil war within a century. She tilted her head slightly. You, Ambassador Cross, appear to be the opposite. Perhaps that is refreshing, or perhaps it is simply different. I'll take different over doomed, Julian said. They moved toward the throne room where the real negotiations would begin. Julian's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment everything depended on. He tried to focus on his talking points, on the carefully constructed arguments for why Earth deserved a chance. He didn't notice the floor ahead beginning to ripple. The observation deck stretched before them like a window into madness. Julian had thought the Hall of Ancestors was impressive, but this chamber made that look like a suburban living room. The entire outer wall wasn't there. Or rather, it was there but rendered invisible by some technology that let the void of space press against them with nothing but a shimmer in the air suggesting anything separated them from instant death. "This is where we contemplate infinity," Sarathva said, her voice softer than before, almost reverent. "Where my people come to remember how small we are, despite our achievements." Julian's instinct was to step back from the non-existent wall, but he forced himself forward instead. Stars wheeled past in patterns that suggested the palace was rotating, though he felt no motion. A gas giant dominated the view to his left, its storms churning in bands of copper and jade. "It's beautiful," he managed. "Terrifying but beautiful, like looking at something that could kill you and choosing to appreciate it anyway." An apt description of many things worth experiencing. Sarathva moved to stand beside him, close enough that he caught a scent like rain on metal. "Tell me, Ambassador, what do your people fear most about joining the galactic community?" The question caught him off guard. He'd expected to discuss trade agreements, territorial boundaries, technology exchanges, the dry mechanics of alliance. Not this. "That we'll lose ourselves," he said after a moment. "That we'll become copies of older species, give up what makes us human in exchange for fitting in. There's a word we have, assimilation. It sounds clinical, but it terrifies us." Sarathva's ears tilted forward slightly, an expression his briefing materials had labeled as interest. "The Velkari understand this fear. We have watched 17 species dissolve themselves trying to become something they were not. It always ends in tragedy." 17, that's... Julian tried to wrap his mind around the number. "How long have you been watching species rise and fall?" "I personally, or my people?" She glanced at him, and he caught something ancient in that look. "I have ruled for 214 of your years. The Velkari have observed galactic politics for 40,000. Julian's brain stuttered. 200 years old. She looked 30, maybe, by human standards. The absurdity of it hit him like a physical force. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm trying to process the fact that you're older than my entire family tree, and I'm standing here making bad jokes about space architecture. This is like a mayfly trying to explain mortality to a redwood." That wind-through-tube sound came from one of the attendants who had followed them at a discreet distance. Julian was starting to think it might be laughter. "Your metaphors are chaotic," Sarathva said. "I find them oddly compelling." They walked along the invisible barrier, stars sliding past like they were swimming through the galaxy. Julian noticed the floor here had a different quality, less organic, more crystalline, with hairline fractures running through it in geometric patterns. Beautiful, but it made him vaguely uneasy. "The treaty your superiors propose is extensive," Sarathva continued. "Technology sharing, military cooperation, cultural exchange. But treaties are words. I need to understand what humanity truly is before I commit my people to your fate." "Well, we're stubborn," Julian offered. "Arguably too stubborn. We once had a war that lasted 100 years over who had the right to tax tea. We're still arguing about whether that was justified. You make war over beverages. We make war over everything. It's kind of our thing. We're trying to be better about it, but old habits die hard when you're only a few thousand years into civilization. He rubbed the back of his neck. Look, I'm probably supposed to sell you on humanity's noble qualities and our potential for greatness. But honestly, we're a mess. We're brilliant and stupid in equal measure. We create incredible art and then argue about what it means until we ruin it. We'll help a stranger for no reason, then turn around and hurt each other over the smallest differences. Sarethva stopped walking. The stars continued their rotation behind her, making her seem like the still point in a turning universe. Why did they send you, Julian Cross, a self-proclaimed minor administrator who makes light of his people's flaws? It was the first time she'd used his given name. Something about it made the moment feel more real, less like political theater. Because the ambassadors who were supposed to come died, he said quietly. The ship before mine hit a navigation error in the Kepler gap. 12 people, all better qualified than me, all gone in an instant. I was next on the list. I think they picked me originally because I was expendable, someone to send on a probable failure mission so they could say they tried. Then everyone ahead of me died, and suddenly I was it. Humanity's great hope by process of elimination. The Queen studied him with those ancient eyes. You speak of this tragedy with surprising calm. I didn't know them well, Julian admitted. That probably makes me a terrible person, but I'm trying to be honest here. I was sorry they died, genuinely. But I also didn't have time to grieve because suddenly I was cramming 2 years of diplomatic training into 3 weeks and trying not to think about the fact that I was completely unqualified. And yet you came. What else was I going to do? Say no. Julian laughed, but it came out bitter. Humanity needs this alliance. The Cortex Dominion is expanding toward our territory, and we have exactly zero ability to stop them without help. If I'd refused, they would have just sent someone else, someone even less prepared. At least I'm good at talking. Usually, when I'm not babbling about T-wars. Sarethva turned back to the stars, her expression contemplative. The Cortex, she said, and something in her tone suggested familiarity. Yes, they would view your worlds as convenient additions to their empire. They are efficient conquerors if nothing else. So you understand why we're desperate. I understand desperation often leads to poor decisions. She glanced at him sideways. But also that it can lead to honest ones. You interest me, Ambassador. You wear your inadequacy like armor, deflect with humor, admit weakness as if it were strategy. I cannot decide if you are brilliantly manipulative or simply too inexperienced to lie properly. Can I vote for option 2? Because I promise you I'm not that clever. The attendants made that sound again. Julian was definitely counting it as laughter now. They moved deeper into the observation deck, passing sections where the floor became transparent as well, creating the dizzying sensation of floating in space. Julian's stomach protested, but he kept his expression neutral, mostly neutral, probably not neutral at all, actually. The Velkari value strength, Sarethva said, but we also value adaptability. We have seen powerful species crumble because they could not bend, could not change. Your people are young enough to learn to adapt. This is rare. We're basically children who found the keys to a spaceship, Julian said. The question is whether that makes us worth teaching or too dangerous to trust. An apt question. She stopped at a section where the floor showed a view directly down onto the planet below. Cities glittered like circuit boards, connected by streams of light that Julian realized were transit systems moving at incomprehensible speeds. I will be honest with you, since you have been honest with me. The Velkari Empire is ancient. We are stable. We are also, if I may speak freely, bored. Julian blinked. I'm sorry, did you just say bored? When you have existed for thousands of years, when you have achieved every technological marvel, conquered every challenge, catalogued every phenomenon, what remains? She spread her hands, and for the first time Julian saw something like vulnerability in her bearing. We are stagnant, perfect perhaps, but stagnant. Your people are chaos, unpredictable, messy. This either threatens us or revitalizes us. So we're either a catastrophic mistake or the best thing that's happened to you in millennia. No pressure. Sarethva smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face from regal to something almost warm. Exactly so. They stood there for a moment, human and alien, separated by millennia of evolution, but united in the absurdity of the situation. Julian felt the weight of it, the impossibility of this conversation, this moment. Everything humanity had built, every hope and dream and desperate gamble, balanced on his ability to not completely screw this up. "The throne room awaits," Sarethva said finally. "The formal negotiations must begin. But I wanted you to see this first, to understand what we are. We are not just an empire to bargain with. We are beings who have forgotten what it means to be surprised." "Well, if it helps, I'm basically a walking surprise," Julian offered. "Usually the bad kind, but still. We shall see." She turned toward the exit, her attendants falling into formation. "Stay close, Ambassador. The palace can be disorienting for those not accustomed to its ways." The path to the throne room crosses several sections where the architecture becomes unstable. Merely a design feature, but humans lack our innate spatial awareness. Julian followed, watching the floor ahead begin to shift in subtle ways, patterns emerging and dissolving like breathing. Unstable architecture. That sounded ominous. "Define unstable," he said. But Sarethva was already moving forward, and Julian had no choice but to follow her into whatever came next. The transition from the observation deck to the throne room should have been straightforward. Should have been. But the heart had other ideas. Julian noticed the change immediately. The corridor they entered felt wrong in ways his brain struggled to articulate. The walls seemed to breathe in patterns that didn't match his own rhythm, creating a subtle dissonance that made his inner ear rebel. The floor beneath his feet shifted from solid to something that gave slightly with each step, like walking on a surface that couldn't quite decide what state of matter it wanted to be. "This section dates back 3,000 years, Sarethva said, seemingly unbothered by the reality-bending architecture. "It was grown during the reign of Karethman, who believed buildings should challenge their inhabitants. He was considered eccentric even by our standards. So you're telling me someone designed this to be deliberately confusing?" Julian pressed his hand against the wall for balance and immediately regretted it. The surface was warm and pulsed under his palm like a heartbeat. "That's just mean." He called it philosophical. "The palace should remind us that we do not control everything, even in our own halls." Sarethva glided forward with the ease of someone who had walked this path countless times. "My people find it meditative. My people would find it nauseating and sue for emotional distress." One of the attendants made that wind sound again. Julian was starting to appreciate that at least someone found his discomfort amusing. They entered a wider space that Julian's mind wanted to call a hall, but was geometrically something else entirely. The walls curved away at angles that shouldn't work, creating alcoves that seemed to recede into impossible distances. Ancient Velkari artifacts floated in some of these spaces, suspended by technology or possibly just spite against physics. "The War Memorial," Sarethva announced, gesturing to a particularly large alcove where what looked like a crystallized explosion hung frozen in mid-detonation. "This commemorates our victory over the Harkin swarm 7,000 years ago. They believed overwhelming numbers could defeat superior technology. They were incorrect." Julian approached carefully, watching the frozen blast rotate slowly. Inside the crystal he could see tiny figures preserved at the moment of conflict. "You turned a battle into art. We turned survival into remembrance." She moved beside him, her voice taking on a formal quality. "The Harkin would have consumed all life in this sector. We stopped them, but we also learned from them. They taught us that even victory has costs, that strength must be tempered with wisdom." Pretty sophisticated for what looks like a crystal paperweight of doom. Sarethva's lips twitched. "You reduce everything to absurdity." "It's a coping mechanism. Either I joke about the frozen explosion, or I have an existential crisis about how humanity has accomplished exactly nothing compared to you, and I'm trying to save that crisis for after the negotiations. Practical. She turned away from the memorial, her robes creating those impossible afterimages again. The throne room lies beyond the next passage. There, we will discuss terms in earnest. My council awaits, as do representatives from 3 other allied species. They will observe, judge, and ultimately vote on whether humanity merits our consideration. Julian's stomach dropped. I'm sorry, what other species? Did you think this decision rested solely with me? Saratha glanced back, one elegant eyebrow raised. The Velkari Empire is vast, Ambassador. Our alliances span dozens of worlds. When we accept a new partner, all must agree. It is democratic, after a fashion. You buried that detail pretty deep in the briefing materials. Julian ran his hand through his hair, a nervous habit he'd never managed to break. So I'm not just convincing you. I'm convincing a committee of alien species I've never even heard of. The briefing materials you received were simplified for human comprehension. We did not wish to overwhelm you. She paused. Though I see now that perhaps we should have been more forthcoming. You think? Julian laughed, but it came out strained. Okay. Multiple species council vote, absolutely no pressure whatsoever. Great, this is fine. Everything is fine. You are panicking. I'm strategically concerned. You are panicking, Saratha repeated, but something in her tone had softened. Ambassador Cross, if it provides comfort, know that I have already decided to support your petition. My vote alone will not guarantee acceptance, but it carries significant weight. Julian stared at her. You've decided, already. We haven't even gotten to the formal negotiations. I have been negotiating with you since you stepped off your shuttle. She tilted her head, those long ears catching the bioluminescent light. Everything is negotiation, Julian. How you speak, how you react, what you choose to reveal and conceal. You have been honest about your inadequacies while remaining committed to your purpose. You have shown both humility and determination. These qualities suggest your species, while young, may be worth the investment. I don't know whether to be flattered or terrified that I've been under evaluation this whole time. Both would be appropriate. They moved toward the passage she had indicated, and Julian felt his anxiety ratchet up another notch. Through the opening ahead he could see light, brighter than the ambient glow of the corridors, and hear sounds, voices in multiple registers, some that his translator rendered as speech and others that came through as harmonics his ears couldn't quite parse. Remember, Saratha said, pausing at the threshold, confidence without arrogance, honesty without weakness, and whatever you do, do not. She never finished the sentence, because that's when Julian stepped on the unstable section of floor. Later, he would replay the moment endlessly in his mind, trying to pinpoint exactly where things went wrong. Maybe it was how he'd shifted his weight, trying to get a better view of the throne room ahead. Maybe it was simple bad luck, the universe's cosmic sense of humor manifesting at the worst possible moment. Maybe the floor had been waiting 3,000 years for someone to step on that exact spot, like a trap set by a long-dead architect with a grudge against the future. The surface beneath his right foot simply stopped being solid. Julian felt it go, felt the sudden absence of support, and his training, what little he'd absorbed in 3 frantic weeks, completely abandoned him. His arms windmilled instinctively, body twisting as gravity took over with gleeful enthusiasm. He had a fraction of a second to think this is bad, followed immediately by this is historically, catastrophically bad, and then his hand was moving through space trying to catch something, anything, to arrest his fall. What his hand caught was Saratha's backside. The contact was brief, barely a second, but time dilated in that horrible way it does during disasters. Julian's palm connected with fabric and the form beneath it, his fingers actually gripping for balance before his brain caught up with what was happening and flooded his system with enough adrenaline to power a small city. He stumbled forward, finally catching his balance on floor that had decided to be solid again, and froze. The throne room had gone absolutely silent. Julian's eyes, which had been focused on not dying, finally registered his surroundings. The chamber was massive, its walls covered in moving images of stars and galaxies, its ceiling lost somewhere in a haze of light that might have been atmosphere or energy or both. Dozens of beings stood arranged in a semicircle, Valkyrie nobles with their distinctive ears, but also others. Creatures with too many limbs, beings that seemed to exist partially in different dimensions, entities that his brain struggled to categorize as anything other than wrong in the most fundamental sense. All of them were staring at him. More specifically, all of them were staring at where his hand had been approximately 2 seconds ago. Sarethva stood perfectly still. Her back was to him, but he could see the absolute rigidity in her posture, could see how her hands had curled into fists at her sides. Slowly, with the terrible inevitability of an avalanche, she turned. Her face was a mask. Not angry, that would have almost been better. She looked stunned, like someone had just spoken to her in a language that shouldn't exist, had done something so far outside her frame of reference that her ancient mind was still processing whether it had actually happened. Around the room, soldiers materialized from alcoves Julian hadn't noticed. They moved with liquid speed, their armor shifting colors as weapons manifested in their hands, energy rifles that hummed with barely contained violence. Every single one was pointed at Julian. He started, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat, tried again. I am so sorry, the floor, I didn't mean to. One of the alien council members, something that looked like it was made of crystallized shadow, made a sound like breaking glass. Another, a being covered in what might have been scales or possibly feathers, or possibly something biology hadn't invented yet, reared back in what was clearly shock. The Valkyrie nobles had flattened their ears completely against their skulls, and Julian's frantic mental review of the briefing materials suggested this was the physical equivalent of a scream. Julian became aware that he was still talking, words tumbling out in a panicked stream. The floor became unstable, which you literally warned me about 30 seconds ago, and I lost my balance because human inner ears are apparently garbage compared to everyone else's, and I was just trying not to fall on my face in front of the Galactic Council, and I swear on everything humanity has ever built that this was an accident. Silence, Sarethva said. Julian's mouth snapped shut. The Queen stared at him with those ancient eyes, and Julian watched a dozen emotions flicker across her face too quickly to identify. Shock, certainly. Confusion, something that might have been calculation. And beneath it all, something he couldn't name, something that made his skin prickle with an awareness that he just irrevocably changed something fundamental. She raised one hand, palm out, and the soldiers froze but didn't lower their weapons. Explain, she said, and her voice was dangerously quiet. Explain to me what you think just happened. The private chamber Sarethva dismissed everyone to was somehow more intimidating than the throne room. Smaller, quieter, with walls that showed nothing but a soft amber glow that pulsed in time with Julian's racing heartbeat. Or maybe that was just his imagination working overtime. The guards had wanted to stay. The council members had demanded it, actually, in multiple languages that Julian's translator rendered as variations on "Seize the Barbarian." But Sarethva had spoken a single word in her musical language, and every being in that throne room had gone silent and retreated, though not without backward glances that promised future consequences. Now it was just the two of them, and Julian was absolutely certain he was about to die. Sit, Sarethva commanded, gesturing to a seat that grew from the floor like a mushroom, adjusting its shape to human proportions. Julian sat. His legs were shaking anyway. The Queen paced, her robes swirling in agitation. She hadn't said anything for a full minute, just walked back and forth across the chamber while Julian sat there drowning in his own mortification and fear. He'd touched alien royalty. He'd grabbed the Queen's ass in front of the Galactic Council. This was beyond diplomatic incident. This was the kind of story that would be told for generations as a cautionary tale about why humans shouldn't be allowed in polite society. "I have lived for 214 years, Sarathva said suddenly, her voice tight. "In that time, I have presided over 17 first-contact situations. I have negotiated treaties with species so different from my own that we required quantum computers to find common conceptual ground. I have faced assassination attempts, political coups, and one memorable incident involving a visiting dignitary who attempted to consume me because his species considers eating one's host the highest compliment." "I really don't think this is the same as," Julian started. "I am not finished." She stopped pacing, turned to face him. "In all of that time, in all of those experiences, no one, not one being in 2 centuries, has ever done what you just did." Julian winced. I know, and I cannot apologize enough." "You grabbed me," she said, and there was something in her voice he couldn't identify. "In front of the assembled council, in the throne room. You, a human ambassador whose species has barely left its solar system, physically grabbed the Valkyrie Queen." "The floor gave out," Julian said desperately. "I swear to you on everything I am, it was an accident. I wasn't trying to. I would never. I don't even have words for how not on purpose that was." Sarathva moved closer, and Julian fought the urge to shrink back in his seat. She leaned down, her face level with his, close enough that he could see flecks of silver in her eyes. "I know," she said quietly. Julian blinked. "You what?" "I know it was an accident, Julian Cross. I saw the floor destabilize. I saw you lose your balance. I watched the entire catastrophic sequence of events unfold with perfect clarity." She straightened up, and to Julian's absolute shock, her lips curved into something that might have been a smile. "What I cannot decide is whether this makes the situation better or worse." "I'm voting for worse," Julian said weakly. "Definitely worse. On a scale of diplomatic disasters, this is what's bigger than catastrophic, apocalyptic. World-ending. Species-ending, possibly," Sarathva agreed, but her tone had lost its edge. She moved to another chair that grew from the floor across from him and sat with fluid grace. "The council is furious. The Valkyrie nobles are demanding your immediate expulsion, possibly your execution. The representative from the Thrain Collective believes you have insulted all royalty everywhere and wants you tried under galactic law." Julian felt what little color remained in his face drain away. Okay, that's really bad." "Yes. Is there any version of this where I don't die or get humanity permanently banned from space?" Sarathva regarded him with those ancient eyes, and Julian saw something shifting in her expression. "Tell me, Ambassador, in that moment when you were falling, what went through your mind?" "Terror," Julian said immediately. "Just pure, unadulterated terror. Not even about touching you. I didn't know I was going to do that until it happened. I was just terrified of falling, of looking like an idiot, of ruining everything for humanity in front of everyone important. I've never been more aware of how completely out of my depth I was. And yet you came anyway. You accepted this mission knowing you were unprepared. What else could I do?" Julian spread his hands helplessly. "Say no. Let them send someone else. Humanity needs help. The Cortex are coming and we can't stop them alone. So yeah, I came. I came knowing I'd probably fail, but at least I could say I tried." Sarathva leaned forward slightly. "Do you know what I saw in that moment? Me committing career suicide. Fear," she said. "Genuine, unfiltered fear. Not of me, not of consequences. Just the very human, very honest fear of someone who was trying desperately not to fall." She paused. "And then after you grabbed me, do you know what I saw?" Julian shook his head, not trusting his voice. "Immediate horror, instant recognition of what you had done, followed by the most sincere apology I have heard in a century." She stood, began pacing again, but the movement was different now, thoughtful rather than agitated. "Julian, Do you understand how rare sincerity is in galactic politics? Everyone has an angle, a strategy, a carefully calculated approach. Even their mistakes are often deliberate, designed to create opportunities or test boundaries. I promise you that was not strategic, Julian said. That was just me being catastrophically clumsy. I know, that is what makes it remarkable. She stopped, turned to face him fully. For the first time in longer than I can remember, something surprised me. Something broke through the endless predictability of diplomatic theater. You did not mean to, stars. You would have done anything to avoid it, but you surprised me. Julian stared at her, his brain struggling to process where this was going. So, you're not going to have me executed. I am going to do something far more interesting. Sarethva's smile widened, and Julian saw something almost mischievous in it. I am going to keep you here. I'm sorry, what? As my personal guest, ostensibly to observe human behavior, to determine if your species truly merits our alliance. In reality, she moved to the wall, where the amber glow shifted to show an exterior view of the palace. In reality, because you have done what I thought impossible, you have made me curious again. Julian's mind raced. The council will never accept that. They want me gone. The council will accept what I tell them to accept, Sarethva said with casual confidence. I am queen. My word on matters of diplomatic protocol is final. I will frame it as a test. Humanity's representative will remain in the palace under observation to prove whether his species can adapt to galactic civilization. The council will grumble, but they will accept it. And what actually happens during this test? She turned back to him, and her expression was more open than he'd seen it. We talk. You tell me about humanity, your chaos and your potential. I tell you about the Velkari, our achievements and our stagnation. We learn from each other. And perhaps, if you prove as interesting as I suspect, I will have reason to advocate for your species beyond simple political calculation. Julian felt something loosen in his chest, the terror that had gripped him since the throne room incident finally releasing its hold. You're using me accidentally grabbing you as an excuse to have conversations you want to have anyway. I am using your catastrophic breach of protocol as an opportunity to do something unprecedented, yes. She moved closer again, but this time there was no threat in the gesture. Tell me honestly, Julian Cross, are you willing to stay here, knowing the council hates you, knowing every moment will be scrutinized, knowing you might still fail to secure the alliance your people need? Are you kidding? Julian laughed, and it came out slightly hysterical. I grabbed the queen's ass and I'm not being executed. At this point I'll take any outcome that doesn't end with me scattered across space. If you want me to stay and have philosophical conversations about humanity's place in the galaxy, that sounds fantastic compared to the alternative. Sarethva laughed then, a real laugh that filled the chamber with harmonics that made Julian's bones vibrate pleasantly. You truly are absurd. I really am, Julian agreed, but apparently that works for me somehow. It does. She extended her hand in a gesture that was almost human. Very well, Ambassador. Welcome to extended diplomatic residency. Try not to touch anything else inappropriate. Julian took her hand, felt the warmth of her skin, the slight difference in bone structure that marked her as alien. I make no promises. I'm apparently terrible at spatial awareness. Then we will station guards around unstable flooring. She pulled him to his feet with surprising strength. Come, we must return to the throne room and announce this decision before the council convinces itself you have been executed in secret. They will protest, but ultimately they will accept. And tomorrow we begin your real education in galactic politics. Julian followed her toward the door, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. An hour ago he'd been certain his career, possibly his life, was over. Now he was the Queen's personal guest, granted access to the kind of knowledge and influence he couldn't have imagined. All because he tripped on alien flooring and grabbed royalty by accident. For what it's worth, he said as they reached the door, I really am sorry about the grabbing thing. Saratha glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. Are you? Because that single moment of human clumsiness may have just changed the course of galactic history. Your species needed an advocate, Julian. Now you have one. All it cost was your dignity and my personal space. When you put it that way, it sounds almost strategic. Almost, she agreed. But we both know it was not. That is what makes it perfect. The door opened, revealing the throne room beyond, and the assembled council waiting with various expressions of hostility and confusion. Julian took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped forward into whatever came next. He'd come to